something a little darker tonight. While Rome gifted us roads, aqueducts, and systems of law, it also delivered some of the most bizarre, theatrical, and deeply unsettling punishments the ancient world ever devised. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Vestals buried alive. The steep price of purity in ancient Rome. The Vestal. Virgins were the spiritual backbone of Rome, like sacred public infrastructure. If they failed, it was believed everything could unravel. These girls were chosen before puberty to serve Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and their main job was to tend the eternal flame and avoid all men for 3 full decades. Breaking their vow of chastity wasn't seen as a minor slip-up. In Roman eyes, it was like setting off a bomb in the Senate. If caught being intimate, a Vestal wasn't executed in a conventional way. She was buried alive, yes, literally entombed beneath the earth. Why not just behead her like other criminals? Romans believed shedding a Vestal's blood would enrage the gods. So they found a legal workaround: dig a pit, lower her inside with a small oil lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water, because even ancient execution had hydration standards, then seal her in. No blood, no mess, no divine retribution. She'd lie in total darkness, alone, contemplating her fate, while Rome carried on, and the man involved. Usually flogged to death publicly. Quicker, but still brutal. To be fair, being a Vestal came with serious perks: front-row seats at events, luxurious travel, and the power to pardon condemned individuals with a single command. But all that privilege hinged on absolute obedience. One mistake, and you were sealed underground for good. Rome took this seriously. One notable case involved a Vestal named Cornelia, accused during the reign of Emperor Domitian. Before her sentence, she reportedly cried, "Does Caesar think I slept with a god? Because no mortal touched me." It didn't help. So next time your job feels overwhelming, just remember, at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you. Alive with stale bread and a flickering oil lamp. Rome, where HR policy came carved in stone. Poena Cule. Death by sack Rome, the land of philosophers, architects, and punishments that sound like surreal nightmares. Let's talk about Poena Cule, literally, penalty of the sack. No, not a medieval game show. This was Rome's response to the ultimate crime: killing your father. You weren't just fined or jailed. You got the deluxe execution treatment, complete with animal co-stars. First, your hands were tied. You were sewn into a large leather sack. Uncomfortable, sure, but it gets worse. You were joined inside by 4 animals: a dog for loyalty you failed to show, a monkey for chaos, a snake to slither through your guilt, and a rooster, maybe to herald your doom. Then, the whole sack, writhing with creatures and regret, was tossed into a river, preferably a deep one, inside chaos, barking, screeching, hissing, pecking, all while you flailed in panic. Symbolic? Historians think so. Dogs for family bonds, monkeys for disorder, snakes for betrayal, roosters for vigilance. Your crime represented in fur, feathers, and fangs. Imagine being thrashed by a monkey, bitten by a snake, the dog going wild, while the rooster crows like it's just another Tuesday. It was rare, but not forgotten. Emperors with a flair for drama revived it from time to time to make a statement. Punishment wasn't just about death, it was about unforgettable spectacle. So next time your dad forgets your birthday, be thankful. In ancient Rome, patricide didn't lead to therapy. It meant sack time with the animal kingdom, inverted crucifixion, turning suffering on its head. When we hear crucifixion, we picture a wooden cross, a drawn-out, public death designed to terrify onlookers. Rome's trademark execution, slow, humiliating, and very visible, but sometimes Rome got creative. Enter the inverted crucifixion, death, flipped upside down. This wasn't for just anyone. It was reserved for those who deeply challenged authority, traitors, defiant rebels, and symbolic martyrs. The most famous case? St. Peter, one of Jesus' apostles. Tradition says, when sentenced under Nero, he requested to be crucified upside down, feeling unworthy to die like Christ. Rome, ever practical, agreed. Now, regular crucifixion was already horrific: blood loss, asphyxiation, exposure. But flipped, it became worse. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained unnaturally. Breathing, nearly impossible. It's like sitting through a boring lecture, only upside down, while nails are driven into your ankles. Peter's death became a symbol of humility, but over time the upside-down cross was misinterpreted, later used in horror, films and heavy metal to suggest defiance or evil. Rome didn't care about that symbolism. For them, it was about deterrence. Cross them, and they'd make your death as brutal and memorable as possible. So the next time you hear inverted crucifixion, remember, it wasn't just death. It was performance with a painful twist. Decimation. The original morale booster. Roman. Style. When you think of motivation, maybe you picture a coach yelling, "We win as one." In Rome, it was more like, "We march," or "1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to decimation, a military punishment so severe it makes modern training look like a retreat. If a unit showed cowardice, tried to desert or mutinied, the commander had a terrifying option. The soldiers were lined up, every 10th man drew lots, the unlucky one beaten to death by his 9 comrades, using clubs, stones, whatever was handy. So not only did you face death, but your fellow soldiers had to be your executioners. Possibly guys you'd just shared dinner with the night before, all to prove loyalty, and it didn't end there. The survivors weren't exactly celebrated. They received barley instead of wheat as rations, a not-so-subtle "we're disappointed," and were made to sleep outside the fort's safety. The reasoning: if you feared your comrades more than the enemy, you'd stand your ground. Harsh logic, but it worked. Roman discipline became legendary. One of the most infamous uses came from Cassius, the wealthy general, aligned with Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating loss during the Spartacus revolt, he decimated his own troops. Nothing says "we're getting serious" like an internal purge. So if your manager says your team needs to work on accountability, at least you're not living under Cassius. In Rome, failure was punished collectively and permanently. The fork of heretics, a torture device nobody asked for. Fast forward to the later Roman Empire, a time of fading glory, rising fear, and obsessive heresy hunting. Speak against the church? Challenge a sacred belief? Rome didn't argue, they handed you the fork of heretics. Picture a metal rod with 2 prongs at both ends, one dug beneath your chin, the other pressed against your upper chest. A steel trident for your neck. Once it was fastened, movement was forbidden. Look down, punctured, glance sideways, stabbed, try to whisper something. The fork made sure you didn't. It didn't draw blood at first. That was the genius. This wasn't execution. It was endurance. Victims often stood for days, muscles trembling, heads rigid, straining to avoid impalement, torture by exhaustion. Despite its name, the fork wasn't exclusive to heretics. It was used on blasphemers, witches, suspected liars, anyone who upset a bishop before his morning wine. Some versions were engraved with Latin phrases like, "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty." Because what's more persuasive than forced confession via sharp metal and religious guilt? This wasn't even among Rome's worst punishments. It was more of a gateway torment. No blood, no crowd, just silence, tension, and days of agonizing stillness. So the next time you're holding in a sneeze during an important meeting, imagine doing that for 72 hours, with a fork at your throat. Section 1. The Tarpeian Rock, Rome's ultimate rejection. In ancient Rome, silence wasn't peaceful. It was imposed with iron tools and a stiff neck. Being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock was the Roman version of getting unfriended, only more literal. Forget cryptic messages or unsubtle online blocks. If you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut ties, they hurled you off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock, an 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just steps away from the Roman Forum. It wasn't just a scenic ledge, it served as a state-sponsored disposal system for traitors. And yes, it was exactly as theatrical as you'd expect. The cliff was named after Tarpeia, a Roman girl who traded the city's safety for what she assumed were gold bracelets from invading Sabines. Unfortunately, the Sabines took her literally and crushed her under their shields, technically delivering what she asked for. Her body was thrown from the cliff, and the site took her name. The lesson: don't trust enemies or unclear payment terms. From then on, the Tarpeian Rock became the Republic's preferred method for handling those who crossed the line. Corrupt politicians, false witnesses, or anyone Rome believed deserved a definitive end. No hanging, no blades, just gravity and consequences. The condemned were typically stripped, displayed, and led to the cliff's edge. The drop did the rest. And yes, the public watched. Executions often drew crowds, adding drama to everyday life. This wasn't just death. It was erasure from both the city and its civic identity. Rome's version of cancel culture was literal and permanent. Interestingly, the rock sat close to the Temple of Jupiter, so if someone lied to the gods or the state, their final seconds included a brief view of divine judgment. Over time, other methods of execution became popular: wild animals, crucifixion, or flaming garments. But the Tarpeian Rock remained a Roman classic, simple and unmistakable in its message. So the next time someone says, "They really threw him under the bus," remember, Romans did it first. No bus, just stone, betrayal, and an abrupt ending. Section 2. Damnatio ad bestias. Executions as public entertainment. Damnatio ad bestias, Latin for condemnation to the beasts. Welcome to the Colosseum. Sweat, stone, and a crowd of 50,000. This was ancient Rome's version of primetime television, except the programming involved lions and lots of blood. This punishment was used on criminals, enemy soldiers, political dissenters, and tragically early Christians who refused to honor the state's gods. But it wasn't just about execution. It was about putting on a show. Victims were thrown into the arena where lions, leopards, bears, and sometimes even elephants awaited. And in true Roman fashion, they were often costumed, cast as characters from myths. One might portray Orpheus and be attacked mid-performance. Another might play Prometheus, only to have birds peck at him in a cruel reenactment. It was part punishment, part theatre, and part propaganda. Justice was merged with entertainment and a not-so-subtle message: obey or suffer. There were no defences or appeals here. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a death sentence applauded by the masses. And if the animals weren't lively enough, guards used hot irons or starvation to ensure the crowd got what they came for. The condemned didn't have to be violent criminals. Theft, disobedience, or holding the wrong beliefs could land you in the arena. Often your only hope was a benevolent emperor, someone with the authority to spare you. Otherwise, you became a warning for everyone watching. Rome didn't just use fear, they staged it. And while Christian martyrs eventually reframed this cruelty as martyrdom, most who faced the beasts experienced it as terror, not triumph. So, next time jury duty feels like a chore, be thankful it doesn't involve dodging wild animals in front of an audience. Section 3. Forced suicide, dying with dignity, Roman style. Not every Roman death sentence involved cliffs or colosseums. Sometimes, especially if you were high-ranking, your punishment came with a choice. On the surface, at least enter forced suicide, a paradoxical form of execution that allowed elites to die with dignity. If you were a senator, noble, or someone important enough to own multiple tunics, and you crossed the emperor, perhaps by plotting or simply being inconvenient, you might get a polite message. It went something like this: "You have dishonored the state. Please take the honorable way out." Translation: "End your own life by sundown, or we'll do it ourselves, less pleasantly." The advantage of complying? Your family could keep your property. Your name might even stay intact in official records. It was a form of state-managed dignity, a blood-soaked severance deal. This wasn't seen as shameful. On the contrary, many saw it as noble. It offered control over one's final moment, sometimes performed with a flourish, a warm bath, a blade to the wrist, and a final speech. Very Roman. Take philosopher Seneca the Younger, accused, possibly wrongly, of plotting against Nero, ordered to die. He tried bleeding out from wrists and ankles. When that failed, he drank poison. Still alive, he climbed into a hot bath to speed things up. More chemistry experiment than clean death, it was the Roman ideal of controlled demise. Forced suicide offered the illusion of choice, masking absolute authority. Rome allowed you to opt out, while ensuring you were removed quietly, without a trial or an audience. Just hot water and silence. So if you've ever received an awkward email from your boss, imagine being diplomatically invited to destroy yourself. Rome didn't always execute you. They sometimes gave you the option to do it with grace. Section 4. The wooden donkey. When sitting hurt. If you've ever complained about your desk chair, Rome would like a word. Among their more imaginative punishments was the wooden donkey, better described as the agony saddle. This wasn't a real donkey. It was a narrow V-shaped wooden beam with a sharp ridge shaped like an A-frame. The condemned, often petty thieves, disobedient soldiers, or rebellious slaves, were forced to straddle it, their full body weight pressing down between their legs, but it didn't stop there. Weights were tied to their ankles, increasing pressure and pain. The result was slow tearing of flesh, agonizing and prolonged. Sometimes they were left there for hours. Rome didn't invent the device. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture practices, but they refined it. It wasn't always fatal. Sometimes it served purely as public humiliation. Picture it, a cheating merchant perched on the donkey in a bustling square while kids laughed and vendors sold food. Painful, yes. Educational, absolutely. Generals even used it as field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed could find themselves straddling the donkey as a morale booster. And the variations. Creative. Some donkeys were made of metal, others had spikes, and one was even heated. Rome never stopped innovating. It was humiliating, excruciating, and turned sitting into a form of punishment that left lasting scars, both physical and psychological. So next time your office chair feels stiff, be grateful it isn't a sharpened beam with rocks tied to your ankles. Section 5. Branding the face, identity as punishment. Before ID cards or background checks, Rome had a simpler way of identifying criminals. They branded them, literally, on the face. If you were a thief, runaway slave, or repeat offender, the punishment wasn't just a fine or jail. It was a permanent mark, burned into your forehead or cheek. Using a heated metal rod, letters were scorched into the skin. F for fur, thief. C for calumnia, false accuser. It was a visible warning. Do not trust this person, and it wasn't done in private. Branding was a public event. The goal wasn't just to punish, but to make an example out of you. The result? You couldn't hide your past. Going to the market? People stared. Looking for work or companionship? Good luck. Your face told your story, loudly. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. They were often branded fug for fugitivos, escapee. If they ran again, the punishment escalated. Slaves were property, and their disobedience had to be displayed. Some tried to remove or hide their marks with cuts, tattoos, or makeup. But tampering came with more punishment, like trying to edit a criminal record in real life. Later emperors, like Constantine, tried to limit the use of facial branding, but for centuries it remained a clear and painful form of social control. Tongue removal. When silence was the sentence, in ancient Rome, shame wasn't just a feeling, it was a lifelong sentence. Even punishments placed on hands or legs carried the same message, lasting disgrace. So the next time someone tells you to face the consequences, be thankful they don't mean it literally, because in Rome they certainly did. They didn't. Just remember your crime. They made sure your face bore the memory too. Among the most extreme punishments was tongue removal, reserved for blasphemy. In Rome, free speech came with limits. You could praise the emperor, debate philosophy, even perform poetry, but challenge the gods, insult the emperor, or speak out of turn, and your words might cost you your tongue. Yes, this happened. If your speech was considered a threat, Rome silenced you permanently. There were no anesthetics or clean instruments, just iron tools, brute force, and agony. A soldier or executioner would grip your tongue with forceps and either slice it off or yank it out entirely. This wasn't medical, it was censorship by mutilation, and it wasn't limited to religion. Sure, mocking Jupiter or disrespecting sacred rituals could earn you the penalty, but more often it was political. Criticize the emperor or question Rome's moral code, and suddenly your mouth became a liability. One poorly timed joke, a whispered heresy, or a chant in protest, gone. This punishment was intentionally public and theatrical. Rome sent a message. Words carry weight, but the state's power is heavier. If you survived, life didn't get easier. You couldn't speak clearly, defend yourself, or even cry out in pain. It was isolation through disfigurement, your silence becoming a visible sentence. Some early Christians met this fate. Refusing to deny their faith, they continued preaching. When Rome couldn't stop their message, it targeted the messenger instead. Ironically, those stories of silencing became symbols of faith and resistance, infuriating Roman officials even more. If this all sounds excessive, remember, Rome valued control, and cutting out a person's voice, that was the ultimate control. So the next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be grateful, it's just a saying. Breaking on the wheel. When bones became warnings. Think the Romans were out of ideas for extreme punishment. Enter the breaking wheel, also known later as the Catherine wheel. Less an execution, more a disturbing art form. It turned the human body into a grim spectacle. Here's how it worked. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, limbs outstretched like a human starfish. Then came the real ordeal. Using a heavy iron bar, the executioner would break the person's bones methodically, arms, legs, hips, all shattered one by one. The aim, not instant death, but drawn-out destruction. Ankles twisted, thighs crushed, the body warped into something unrecognizable, and then came the final act. The broken limbs were woven through the wheel's spokes, an anatomical tapestry of pain. Sometimes the wheel was raised on a post as a warning. Other times it spun in the breeze, a morbid wind chime. This punishment was reserved for severe offenses like murder, treason, or highway robbery. It sent a loud and clear message: stray. Too far from Rome's order, and you wouldn't just die. You'd become part of the scenery. Occasionally, victims survived, barely. If someone lingered for days, executioners sometimes offered mercy with a final blow. But the wheel lived on even after Rome. Medieval Europe took the idea and ran with it, adding spikes, fire, and flare. Rome laid the groundwork. Others turned it into theatre. So next time you're stuck in traffic, remember, at least you're not part of a public bone exhibit. Execution by ash, death by dust and silence. Rome didn't just kill, it innovated. One of its more obscure but psychologically devastating punishments was execution by hot ash. Unlike more famous methods, this one was slow, silent, and suffocating. It's credited to Emperor Nero, a man known for making death a spectacle. In one case, a prisoner was buried up to his neck. So far, standard Roman fare. But instead of a sword or stone, a funnel was placed in his mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling oil. Not fire. Ash. Seems harmless? It wasn't. The ash, heated to a searing temperature, clogged the throat, scorched the lungs, and suffocated from within. It didn't kill instantly, it tormented. Every breath was agony, each swallow unbearable. There was no bleeding, no visible burns, just internal collapse. Why ash? Because it was degrading. Ashes were the waste of destruction, used to clean, to erase. Dying in it symbolized total worthlessness. You weren't even worth a sword, just slow suffocation beneath the remains of other ruin. This punishment wasn't common. Nero saved it for those he truly despised, people he wanted erased without spectacle, yet with maximum psychological cruelty. And the effect? Chilling. No screams, no gore, just a body, a hole, and a drift of grey dust. So when you hear ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember, in Nero's Rome, that wasn't just poetic. It was policy. Tunica molesta. When clothing was the weapon in ancient. Rome fashion rarely killed, unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, also known as the flaming death tunic. Imagine this. You're led into an arena or tied to a stake. Instead of chains, the executioner offers you a tunic. Seems merciful, until you realize it's soaked in tar, pitch, and oil. The tunica molesta, literally annoying tunic, was a tightly fitted garment designed to ignite. Once lit, the flames clung to your body, burning skin, hair, and lungs. There was no escape. You couldn't roll to smother it. The garment burned with you. It wasn't just execution, it was spectacle. Emperors like Nero used it during elaborate garden parties. Human torches lit his festivities, those forced to wear it. Arsonists, rebels, and especially Christians. Sometimes, to make it mythologically poetic, they styled it after the poisoned shirt of Hercules, a garment that drove the hero to his death. Rome had a way of turning punishment into performance. The psychology was key. You weren't just dying, you were displayed, screaming engulfed in flames, a human warning to the crowd. Some reports say Nero even played music during the burnings, his own twisted take on entertainment. So next time you're uncomfortable in your clothes, just be thankful they're not flammable and part of a live execution event. In Rome, even, your wardrobe could kill, damnatio memoriae, Rome's ultimate erasure. Most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some reached deeper, into identity, memory, and history itself. Enter damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Perhaps Rome's most chilling punishment because it asked, what's worse than death? Being erased on purpose. If you were an emperor who failed, a general who betrayed, or a senator who fell from grace, Rome might not just execute you, they'd delete you. Statues smashed, names scratched from inscriptions, portraits painted over, documents purged, coins melted down, achievements reassigned, supporters silenced. The most horrifying part? It worked. Many who faced this punishment were once powerful, influential, and today we barely remember them. Whole reigns wiped from history. One infamous case, Emperor Geta. After being murdered by his own brother Caracalla in front of their mother, Caracalla didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's memory erased, public monuments destroyed, his image removed from every corner of the empire. This was historical vaporization, not just a death, but a vanishing act. Rome didn't just kill your body, it killed your legacy. Gaeta. At the emperor's command, Gaeta's image was stripped from mosaics, paintings, and statues. Thousands of inscriptions were altered, his name scraped away by hand. In some surviving art, traces of his figure remain. Awkward gaps, erased faces, half-visible names. It's unsettling, like watching history actively erase itself. But Damnatio Memoriae wasn't just about revenge. It was about power. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could shape the future. If someone could be made to seem as though they never existed, then perhaps their beliefs didn't either. It was the empire's way of declaring, "You were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they're next." What's haunting is how modern it feels. Today we speak of cancel culture, reputations ruined overnight. Rome was doing the same thing 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of social media. So, as we end this strange exploration of Rome's most unusual punishments, remember this: the cruelest fate wasn't fire, lions, or ropes. It was the silence that followed, because in ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen was to be forgotten. The West. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched westward, vast, mysterious, and full of promise. The East, crowded, with cities, factories, and worn-out farmland, had begun to feel confining. But the West, that was possibility. A blank canvas, just dangerous enough to feel real. It started as quiet rumors, shared in taverns, churches, and around dinner tables. Stories of land as open as the sky, rivers that shimmered, and valleys that bloomed effortlessly. The 1803 Louisiana Purchase had more than doubled the size of the young United States. Suddenly, there was land, seemingly endless, and the government claimed it belonged to no one. To many, the West wasn't just a direction, it was a second chance. A place where your name wasn't tied to your past, where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could do. It drew dreamers and outcasts, alike farmers in search of fertile ground, widows chasing peace, wanderers chasing legends shaped by firelight tales. There were no highways, no assurances, and no do-overs. Every journey west began with uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the rivers freeze too early? Would there be food waiting? Yet tens of thousands ventured forth. Entire families, with babies wrapped in flour sacks and grandmothers wedged between crates of salted pork, set off into the unknown. Going west meant risking everything. Staying behind meant accepting a life of limits. The frontier wasn't just land, it was a test of resilience, the ability to forge order from chaos with timber, steel, and sheer will. And as the sun set, over the prairies, stretching shadows across wagon wheels and tired faces, one truth remained. America's story wasn't finished. It was being dragged west, 1 mile at a time. Wagons. Before settlers could face the wilderness, they needed a way to carry not just supplies, but their hopes, their families, and their futures. That vessel was the covered wagon, the backbone of westward migration. It wasn't elegant, not a stagecoach or polished carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels, held together by nails, sweat, and belief. Most didn't build them from scratch. They bought them or refitted old carts. The famous Conestoga wagon was known, but it was too heavy for frontier needs. Something lighter, cheaper, and practical took its place: the prairie schooner. It earned its name from its canvas top, which caught the wind like a sail, turning it into a ship crossing seas of grass. But this ship didn't carry treasure. It carried pork, beans, flour, iron pots, a spinning wheel, a Bible, and perhaps one treasured quilt. Space meant survival. Weight was the enemy. A loaded wagon might carry 2,000 pounds. Any more and the oxen would collapse before reaching the mountains. Horses were too delicate, mules too expensive. Oxen, slow and stubborn, became the real engines of the journey. Families slept inside, underneath or beside their wagons. Privacy was rare, and despite movie myths, people rarely rode inside. The ride was brutal. Most walked, mile after mile, day after dusty day. The wagon wasn't just transportation, it was life support. It held medicines, tools, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even carried baby chicks beneath the wagon bed to start a coop once they settled. But wagons meant more than utility. They were hope in motion. Once the oxen were yoked and the wheels turned, there was no going back. The land behind was gone. Ahead lay only the trail, the sky, and belief in something better. Every jolt, broken axle, and river crossing became a line written in the story of American expansion, not in ink, but in wheel ruts and sheer determination. Life on the trail. Life on the trail wasn't a grand adventure. It was long, hard, and coated in dust. Days began before sunrise. There were no roosters needed, just the sound of leather creaking and wheels groaning. A typical wagon train covered 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and whether anything broke that morning. Over time, trails like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California routes carved themselves into the soil, lined with broken wheels, discarded belongings, and the graves of those who never made it. Meals were basic, repetitive, and rough. Coffee was rare, clean water wasn't guaranteed. Streams might be safe or full of disease. Boiling helped if you had the firewood and time. Otherwise, you relied on luck. Food was rationed, salted, meat, hardtack beans. Occasionally, someone bagged wild game. Wild onions and berries were small luxuries. But the biggest killer wasn't hunger, it was disease. Cholera swept through camps with terrifying speed, killing within hours. Dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites claimed others. There were no doctors, only old remedies and hope. Still, there were moments of happiness. Children played with stones or chased wagon shadows. Weddings and births sometimes happened mid-journey. Families were built, not just by blood, but by shared struggle and dust-caked unity. At night, wagons circled, not for defense from native. Attacks, as often portrayed, but to guard against theft, wild animals and bitter wind. Fires were lit, bread baked on hot stones. Someone might play a fiddle, bringing laughter into the dark. But rest was brief. Morning meant more walking, more wild, and no promises. Trail life was routine for survival. You learned to respect your boots and live with your blisters. You mourned quietly and kept moving. The land didn't wait for sorrow, it only moved west. Homesteading. After weeks or months on the trail, the sight of trees, fresh water, and open land could bring pioneers to their knees. But celebration was short. Once a family found their plot, the real work began. Homesteading was not romantic. There were no homes waiting, no roads, no fences, just land and the looming deadline of winter. Shelter came first, usually a one-room log cabin, barely large enough for the family. Tools were few. Every log had to be chopped, trimmed, and dragged by hand or oxen. There were no chainsaws, no plans, just axes, resolve, and rough guesses. Most cabins had dirt floors, mud in the rain, frozen solid in winter. Windows were simple holes covered with animal skin or greased paper to let light in and cold out. Chimneys were rare. Smoke often vented through holes in the roof. Families coughed constantly. Beds were straw, corn husks, or ropes strung over wood frames. If you were lucky, you sealed the gaps in walls with mud and moss. If not, the wind found its way inside. Then came winter, the real test. Without enough firewood or food, the months ahead meant starvation or frostbite. Snow could trap families, indoors for days. Coyotes howled, wolves lingered, yet the frontier spirit endured. Families made candles from fat, Kids learned to patch clothing, cook over open flames, and read scripture by firelight. They wrote letters, if they had somewhere, to send them. Neighbors were rare, but when one did appear, help was freely given. Roof raisings, shared meals, borrowed animals. Survival wasn't about being tough. It was about community. One family couldn't make it alone, but 10 could. The first winter was more than cold. It was a quiet trial by fire. A season where dreams either hardened into determination or vanished beneath the snow. Frontier women's strength on the frontier wasn't just about muscle. It was about endurance, sacrifice, and a quiet, unwavering courage. No one embodied this more than frontier women. Forget the delicate heroines of dime novels. These women were warriors, in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they became everything at once. Builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, healers, and teachers. If something had to be done, they did it, because no one else would. They rose before sunrise to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, long before most men even woke. They planted gardens, preserved food, tended livestock, and sewed every garment the family wore, often by hand. In times of illness, they made herbal remedies. During childbirth, they served as midwives, sometimes for others, sometimes alone. A frontier woman could kill a snake with a shovel in the morning and teach her children to read that same afternoon. She might lose a child to fever, but dinner would still be on the table by sundown. Guns were no novelty to them. If their husbands were away or gone for good, they defended the homestead with whatever was available: rifles, axes, frying pans. Stories tell of women fending off wolves, raiders, or thieves, all while holding a baby on one hip. Isolation was another challenge. Neighbors could be miles away. Letters took weeks, even months, to arrive. The silence was often overwhelming. Yet these women persisted, building civilization from wilderness, one stitch, one lesson, and one loaf of bread at a time. They also held communities together, organizing barn raisings, caring for the ill, and hosting Sunday gatherings when churches were still just ideas. When towns finally formed, it was often the women who pushed for schools, libraries, and law. They weren't side characters in the story of the frontier. They were the foundation. Uncelebrated, overworked, and frequently overlooked, but unforgettable. Once their strength is understood, so when you picture the Wild West, don't just imagine cowboys on horseback. Picture a woman with pinned-up hair, rolled-up sleeves, a shotgun by the door, and cornbread in the oven. The land was not empty. Every wagon that rolled westward, every cabin raised, and every field plowed. Someone was already there. The American frontier wasn't uninhabited. It was home to hundreds of indigenous nations who had lived on that land for centuries, even millennia. From the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, the land was interwoven with native life. Hunting grounds sacred, spaces, migration routes, rivers with deep meaning. But to the U.S. government and most settlers, it wasn't seen as home. It was seen as opportunity. So began a long and painful dismantling of promises. The U.S. government signed treaty after treaty with native tribes, agreements that guaranteed peace, land, and resources. Yet nearly every one of these treaties was broken. As settlers surged westward, tribes were forced to retreat again and again, sometimes by signature, often by violence. Whole nations were pushed onto reservations, far from their ancestral lands. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Lakota, Comanche, and many others became strangers in their own territories. Some tried diplomacy, others resisted. Armed conflicts broke out. The Black Hawk War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Little Bighorn. Even when native warriors won battles, they lost the war. The government simply returned. With troops, railroads, and settlers eager for land. It wasn't just a seizure of territory, it was cultural erasure. Children were taken from families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages. Sacred practices were banned. Native identity was treated as something to erase, tame, or rewrite, and yet indigenous peoples endured. Their languages were whispered in secret. Their songs were sung in defiance. Their stories lived on. The romantic vision of the frontier often ignores these costs. But the truth is, westward expansion was not a triumph for all. For many, it was a slow, devastating march of loss. To truly understand the frontier, we must hold both truths, the resilience of pioneers and the tragedy of those they displaced, because history, like the land, holds more than one story. Frontier justice, law and order on the frontier arrived slowly, and sometimes not at all. In many early towns, there were no police, courts or jails. Justice wasn't always fair. It often came down to who had the loudest voice, the quickest draw, or the most allies. At first, citizens formed vigilante groups. If a horse was stolen or a store robbed, they acted quickly. Makeshift trials were held in saloons or under trees. If guilt was assumed, punishment followed, fast, a bullet, a rope, or exile with a bruised ego. As towns grew, so did the need for official law enforcement. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies arrived. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became legendary. Some were courageous, others corrupt, many a mix of both. Their tin badges and revolvers made them the thin line between chaos and order. But outlaws weren't far behind. The frontier attracted drifters, deserters, gamblers, and gunslingers, looking to vanish. Men like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks, they captured imaginations. Newspapers turned them into folk heroes, even as they left trails of violence. Justice was inconsistent. A man might hang for stealing a horse or go free after murder if the jury liked him. Bribes worked. So did threats, sometimes revenge war. The disguise of justice, even courtrooms when they existed, were often just general stores with a part-time judge who also sold nails. Over time, real systems emerged. Judges replaced mobs, prisons replaced tree limbs. But the myths remained, and perhaps they always will, because on the edge of the known world, justice wasn't blind. It was armed, dusty, and didn't wait for a second opinion. Steam and signals. In the early days, the American frontier moved as fast as a wagon, slow, creaky, and weather-dependent. But by the mid to late 1800s, that changed. A new sound echoed. Across the prairie, the steam whistle. The railroad changed everything. What once took months could now be done in days. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, it linked east to west, transforming the frontier into a corridor of trade and movement. Towns sprung up overnight along the tracks. Goods from stoves to sewing needles arrived by train, no longer handmade or hoarded. For pioneers, the railroad meant survival. Medicine could arrive in time, crops could reach distant buyers. Letters traveled in days instead of months. The frontier became less risky and more calculated. And alongside the tracks came another breakthrough, the telegraph. Thin strands of copper wire stitched the country together in dots and dashes. For the first time, a rancher in Wyoming could hear about a presidential election minutes after it happened. A sheriff could summon help from 100 miles away. Isolation, once a frontier fear, was broken, one beep at a time. The effects were massive. Economies grew, government extended its reach, law enforcement sped up, but not everyone welcomed this. To many indigenous tribes, the railroad and telegraph were symbols of intrusion, signs that the land was no longer free, but sectioned and owned. Some resisted, sabotaging lines and derailing trains. Still, progress rolled on. Towns the railroad bypassed faded, others exploded into cities. The wilderness shrank, mile by mile, rail by rail. The frontier spirit remained, but it was no longer isolated. It was connected, commercialized, still wild, but now powered by steam and signals. The closing of the frontier by the end of the 19th century, something fundamental had changed. The line that once marked wilderness from settlement, the so-called frontier line, blurred, then vanished. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. The frontier was closed. The great westward expansion was over. The forests were cut. The railroad linked oceans. The buffalo were nearly extinct. Native tribes were confined to reservations. What was once vast and unknown had been mapped, measured, and sold, acre by acre. For some it was a victory, a dream fulfilled, a continent claimed, a nation complete. But for others, especially native peoples, it meant loss, displacement, and silence where homelands had once stood. The end of the frontier wasn't just about geography. It was about identity. The image of the rugged pioneer, the lone cowboy, the gold prospector, these didn't disappear. They became legend. Historians like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier shaped the American spirit, its democracy, resilience, and self-reliance. It gave rise to the cowboy, the log cabin president, the mythic hero. But the real frontier was messier. It was sweat, dirt, disease, and injustice. It was brave and brutal, hopeful and cruel. Full of contradictions, its legacy reflects that tension. Today, the frontier lives on, not in geography, but in spirit, in the idea that venturing into the unknown, whether it's new land, new science, or even space, is part of what it means to be American. The wagons are gone, the cabins are museums, the trails are highways. But listen closely, and you may still hear the frontier in the wind, a story passed down by those who dared to push farther. The frontier didn't disappear. It became the foundation. We crossed a threshold, from using sound for function to using it for feeling. Rhythm became more than just a signal. It became a language of emotion. A hum turned into a lullaby. A scream became a song. There's a theory that music may have come before language, or at least developed alongside it. Long before we spoke, in words we sang. Even today, infants respond more naturally to tone and melody than to actual speech. Something in pitch, rhythm, and vibration speaks directly to our wiring. Music wasn't simply invented, it was remembered. And what's remarkable is that those first sounds weren't limited to the talented or powerful. They were for everyone, a shared part of early human life across the globe. Music arose in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Anywhere there were voices to sing, hands to clap, and things to strike or shake. Long before the first bone flute was carved, before strings were pulled tight or skins stretched across frames, humans already understood that sound could stir the soul. And that was only the beginning. During the cold of Ice Age Europe, when mammoths wandered and glaciers shaped the land, something subtle but revolutionary happened. Not with tools or fire, but with sound. Somewhere in a cave, a human picked up a hollow bird bone, made a few holes in it and blew. The result was a note, pure, intentional, and haunting. This wasn't by chance. It marked the birth of musical instruments. Archaeologists have found flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory over 40,000 years old in sites like the Hohlefels cave in Germany. These weren't easy materials to craft, but their makers carefully shaped finger holes to create a range of notes. That precision tells us something important. This wasn't random. It was structured, repeatable, and made for emotional expression. Why did they make them? Maybe to mimic birdsong, to connect with nature. Maybe the music was part of rituals, marking life, death, or seasonal change. Or perhaps someone carved a flute simply to bring beauty into darkness. It's tempting to think of prehistoric people as focused only on survival, but the flute tells another story of imagination. of someone who saw more than a tool in a bone. These instruments also point to community. While a flute can play alone, in a group it brings harmony, shared experience. Around the fire, flutes may have joined with voices, clapping or drums, struck against logs and stone. Their echoes bouncing off cave walls may have been the first concerts in human history, and these flutes came before agriculture, before wheels, before writing. In the timeline of invention, music wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The flutes of the Ice Age weren't mere objects, they were expressions of joy, grief, mystery, and ritual. Fragile voices from the deep past that still resonate today. From bone and breath, humanity shaped melody, and if the flute was our first voice, the drum was our heartbeat. Long before cities or rulers, people gathered under the stars, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the earth. The drum wasn't invented in one place. It emerged independently across continents and cultures, as if our bodies and the ground beneath us were waiting to be joined in rhythm. The earliest drums were simple, animal skins stretched over a hollow log or clay vessel. They kept time, yes, but also held power. Their beat could call spirits, lead armies, or gather a community. A drum beat wasn't just sound, it was a message. In Africa, some of the world's oldest drumming traditions go back tens of thousands of years. There, drums became voices themselves, able to imitate tonal languages and convey complex ideas. In Siberia, shamans used drums to enter trances, their rhythms unlocking spiritual realms. In the Amazon, water drums echoed like thunder through the jungle, thunder made by human hands. The drum's importance wasn't just in its sound, it was in its accessibility. You didn't need to know melodies or scales, you just needed to feel the rhythm. And we did. Drums were played at births, funerals, weddings, harvests, and battles. Their beat brought order to chaos. They unified the tribe, marked rituals, and prepared warriors for war. The rhythm declared, "We are one." Even in early agriculture, drums had a role. Farmers beat sticks to scare off birds. Harvest festivals included dancing to the drum's pulse. Rhythm didn't just mark time. It marked seasons, cycles, and life transitions. Over time, drums were decorated, painted, carved, even adorned with spiritual symbols. They weren't just instruments, they became sacred objects, symbols of fertility, protection, or divine connection. And they connected us across languages, generations, and worlds. In a time before clocks or writing, rhythm helped us measure both time and feeling. Drums gave sound its structure and meaning. As humanity moved from caves to cities, music evolved too. It shifted from ritual and survival into refined expression. And nowhere was that clearer than in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where rivers built kingdoms and writing was born. Here, music became more elegant. Among temples and ziggurats, we see some of the earliest depictions of string instruments, harps and lyres, etched into tablets, carved into walls, even buried with royalty. These were no longer hidden bone flutes. They were artfully crafted, inlaid with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. Their form was as graceful as their tone. The harp especially became a symbol of refinement, religion, and royalty. In the city of Ur, over 4,500 years ago, archaeologists found the famous bull-headed lyre buried in a noblewoman's tomb. Its face was crowned with a golden bull's head. It was more than an instrument. It was mythology, shaped in wood and string. These harps didn't have frets or fingerboards. Strings were plucked by hand, each note fixed in tone. But what they lacked in range, they offered in atmosphere. They didn't roar like drums, they whispered. Their music lingered, in the air like incense, sacred and dreamlike. In Mesopotamian cities, music became systematic. Musicians were trained. Scales and intervals were recorded in cuneiform. Harps were played in ceremonies, storytelling, even in astronomy, where scholars mapped stars to tones. believing the cosmos itself sang in harmony. Harps found in tombs suggest something powerful. Music was believed to accompany the soul beyond death. It wasn't just for entertainment, it was spiritual design, a bridge between worlds. Unlike the force of drums or the wild voice of flutes, harps brought intimacy to music, thoughtful, measured, and personal. Perhaps for the first time, sound wasn't just for the gods or the tribe, it was for the individual. With wood and string, Mesopotamians gave voice to silence, and from that silence, the first true melodies of civilization emerged. In ancient Egypt, music was more than an art. It was divine language. Egyptians believed music was a gift from the gods. According to myth, it was the goddess Bat, later merged with Hathor, deity of joy and fertility, who first introduced song to the world. So music became not just melody, but identity, woven into ritual, daily life, and sacred practice. Unlike the raw flutes of prehistory or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, Egyptian music blended structure with accessibility. Workers sang to keep rhythm while building pyramids. Fishermen sang to the Nile. Priests chanted hymns during rites. Women played frame drums and rattles during births and funerals, the start and end of life. Egypt's iconic instruments included harps, lutes, lyres, simrams, and flutes. Harps evolved into large, curved pieces, elegantly built with up to 22 strings. Their beauty made them symbols of prestige. Tomb art still vividly captures them thousands of years later. One unique instrument, the simram, a rattle with metal rods, held sacred meaning. Associated with goddess worship, especially of Hathor and Isis, its sound wasn't for pleasure. It was to summon the divine, ward off evil, and protect the soul during rituals. Not all Egyptian musicians were commoners. Some were temple priests or priestesses. Others served in royal courts, performing for pharaohs and foreign guests. Their songs praised gods, rulers, and legacies. Music also linked worlds. At funerals, chants and melodies guided souls through the underworld. Tombs often included lyrics and illustrations of musicians, ensuring that even in death, one wouldn't travel in silence. For Egyptians, music was eternal. It honored the gods, unified the people, and reminded them of Ma'at, cosmic balance. Rhythm wasn't chaos. It was the pulse of the universe. In Egypt, to make music was to echo the sacred. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just sound. It was philosophy. It was the science of harmony, the soul, and the stars. While other cultures used music for ritual or celebration, the Greeks asked a deeper question: why does sound move us?